Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Um, I think we have the quorum. We'll just get started. Um, welcome to the webinar. We have with us today Soham. Soham, thank you so much for finding time. I'll quickly introduce Soham. He's spent a decade in go-to-market, GTM, RevOps, and strategy across companies like Twitter, Mixpanel, and now at Weaviate. Soham's also an active angel investor. He's invested in dev tool companies, AI companies, and he's here today to help us understand how he's done RevOps at B2B startups, B2B SaaS, and now at focused companies. What's the difference? How to build a good signal-based selling motion specifically for a dev tool company. So thank you so much for finding time, and welcome to the webinar.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Awesome. I think most of the people on the call know Rio.dev. For those of you who don't, we are basically helping developer tool companies build and generate pipeline and move to signal-based selling. I'm one of the founders, but today we are going to focus more about Soham's experience and just help Soham, if you could walk us through your journey from where you started to at Weaviate, that would be probably a good starting point.
Yeah, sure. Happy to do that. So my name is Soham. I am currently Weaviate, which is a database platform. My journey through RevOps was kind of accidental in the beginning. It was more so starting out in a consulting firm called Blue Wolf Systems Implementation, and a pretty common path for people in that kind of background was to basically jump into RevOps in one capacity or another. And so I spent time at companies like Twitter, Amazon, NewsCred, doing either being part of a RevOps team or doing kind of a solo RevOps type of role. And really through that process, I started to get introduced to how care about how they go about their day. And I think that's a super fascinating place to spend time. It's something that I really am interested in. I like to be close to the selling without actually doing the selling. And I think RevOps is, as far as kind of my journey at Mixpanel and Weaviate, that's really kind of where signal-based selling and PLG motions have become more relevant. It's a relatively new topic, even though I think the core concepts are pretty solidified and have been around for a long time. But I helped kind of develop the PLG motion and how sellers activate the PLG motion at Mixpanel, and spent about 2.5 years there doing that, and kind of thinking signals sellers care about motion. And then now at Weaviate, I'm helping build the outbound engine and some of our core signals for developers and the folks that work with developers building AI applications. So super interesting space, still relatively new, but lots to learn and lots to do.
Awesome. So thank you for the introduction. Just to give you a little bit about the audience here, I think most of our viewers, listeners, audience come from the developer tool industry. And these are like heads of go-to-market, VP sales, VP marketing, generally GTM leaders who are selling to a very difficult to sell audience, which is developers. And I think this is one thing that the whole industry agrees on, that this is probably one of the toughest personas to be selling to. So what we would love to understand is, how's your experience been? Because you've seen both sides of the journey, right? You've seen the B2B SaaS space with Mixpanel and the companies before that, and now you're seeing it at Weaviate. So if you could maybe start with how it was in Mixpanel and before, and what are the differences that you see at Weaviate, I think that would really help all of us understand the differences.
Yeah, absolutely. As far as signal-based selling, when it comes to B2B, in the beginning and at Weaviate, it was really, really straightforward in the sense that the signals that you care about are some of the more obvious things that even if you were to ask somebody that doesn't really know much about signal-based selling, you really just think from a buyer's perspective. It's some of the more obvious things. And so, a good example when it came to B2B is for sellers at a company like Mixpanel, they were really looking to sell to product managers and heads of product. It was a product analytics tool. And some of the basic things
I think we lost Soham. He'll probably join back soon. While he joins, I think for people on the call, if you have any questions, please feel free to share them on chat. Um, or you can just feel free to raise your hand and ask. We don't need to keep questions to the end. We can keep this very, very interactive. Hey, Soham.
Hey, sorry, I think my Wi-Fi died out.
No,
Not
no
sure
worries.
where you last caught me.
I think last 30 seconds we missed out. You had just started and you were breaking up. So maybe
Sure.
just back up and like, just the whole thing.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, look, I think the core differences. So at Mixpanel, the initial B2B selling motion was really focused on product managers and head of product as a product analytics tool. You're really thinking kind of one-dimensionally in terms of the signals, which is what do your buyers care about and how do you sell to them tops down? Um, those types of purchases tend to happen, I think B2B tools, we like to think that the purchasing process is bottoms up and you get tons of users and then it bubbles up to the buyer and the buyer becomes aware. But the more I've worked with the B2D motion, I've actually started to really learn that that's much more true for B2D as opposed to B2B. B2B, the purchasing tends to come with a kind of lens of the buyer probably has some preconceived notions or tools that they really prefer. And so you're really, really trying to cater to the buyer, which then backs into your signals being what signals are the buyers giving me that they're really interested in the tool? Are they visiting my pricing page? Are they looking at other competitors? What are they doing on my website? Some really, really typical standard things that I think apply to B2B definitely don't apply to B2D. That being said, once you figure out what works, as long as it works, that's all that matters, right? And so I think in a B2B motion, some of these signals were really all you needed, which is, from a marketing lens, do they come to the website and what kind of activity do they do there? And then I think the PLG angle made things a lot more interesting, which is if there's a free trial to your product, which there was at Mixpanel, and if there's a paid version that's self-serve, which there also was, then you have a whole nother layer of actual usage that you can tap into. And so it becomes two-dimensional slightly, but at the end of the day, the signals from your users, you're really taking those and you're actioning them towards your buyers. And the buyers have all the power, and they're the ones that you want to cater to. And I think some of the things that work in B2B that don't work in B2D are more just around the flashiness of your sale, the flashiness of your product, and the overall marketing angle. What I'm learning very quickly with developers is some of that stuff doesn't matter as much, right? It really comes down to utility and the ability for that tool to do what that developer needs to get out of the tool and needs for it to do, right? And so I think that piece is definitely very unique. At the end of the day, the sellers in B2B and at Mixpanel specifically, once we figured out the marketing and product usage stats that mattered, that engine started to work more properly. What we're seeing in B2D is I think the general approach is twofold. One, you want to look at if you don't have an open source company, which Weaviate is open source, but for the sake of argument, if it wasn't open source, the twofold approach is kind of what I refer to as above and below the line. Above the line is what's similar to the B2B motion. At the end of the day, somebody with the purchasing power and the ability to make a decision is the person that needs to understand the utility of the tool. Below the line is the whole different angle here, which I think there's really, really my hypothesis here and what we're approaching this with at Weaviate is building developer groundswell is really what I call it, right? So if you have a developer that's using your tool and is the one developer that's interested, that may be some signal, but ultimately your best bet is not just to tackle that one signal and tap that resource out. It's to build groundswell among 3, 4, 5, 10 developers, especially as you start to tackle enterprise motions. You may almost want to build it up to 50, 100 developers before you really get to the point of starting to understand, hey, now I can go talk to the buyer about actual building that's happening. And then the last thing I'll throw out there before I pause is, open source adds a completely different and much more exciting element. And that's personally what I'm most excited about tackling when it comes to the signal-based world. So
amazing. So thank you for that. And just to make sure, like we captured all of that, right? I'll summarize, especially the B2B part and then the B2D part. So at least from a mixed panel perspective, if you think about it, the top signals are people visiting your website, people trying your free product, and then the usage of the free product sort of gives you very good signals who's going to buy.
sure.
And then third thing is the buyer is usually on the product, or if not on the product, very, very close to the evaluation of the product. So this is what makes it slightly simpler. Now, if we translate that in the B2D world, website, flashiness of the website, of the marketing does not matter. Your product needs to do what the developer wants it to do. There is this whole angle of the developer and the buyer. Developers are not the economic buyers, but they hold as much influence, as much sway in the decision making, and the CTOs will almost never evaluate your product. So marketing flashiness gets replaced by the actual utility of the product. The buyers evaluating gets replaced by developers evaluating, developers using, and then the economic buyer being 2 degrees removed. And then the third thing you mentioned was open source, which is a whole beast in itself, because suddenly your big superpower, which is your free product, which used to give you all of these signals, is gone. Your free product is sitting on Docker or GitHub, which unfortunately you have no visibility into. Did I capture that right?
Absolutely, right. I think I would argue the only change is, the flash, it's not that the flashiness doesn't matter, but I think the flashiness needs to translate, at the end of the day, the CTOs, VPs of engineering, people at that level, they're still technical at their core and they want to understand how things work, is my general kind of hypothesis here. And they want to be able to conceptualize that, and the people they work with and their stakeholders and the CEOs of companies need that translation layer, which is why CTOs get hired there. But the CTOs may not be in the product building in the same way that a head of product would actually want to be in a tool like Mixpanel, looking at a dashboard or a funnel view or a report, saying, hey, I'm getting personal utility out of this. Especially when you look at a tool like Weaviate, like there's no true front end or demo to speak of. And so you need to actually build something useful, which is why your developer groundswell motion is a lot more important. They are the ones who need to go in, conceptualize what they want to build, read through technical documentation, get set up, build something, which is where open source makes it super helpful and low friction. And then once they build something, they can go convey that utility to run it up the chain. So I think you nailed it. Yeah.
Super. So I have 3 follow-up questions on this.
Sure.
First one is, now that we know what doesn't work, help us understand what does work. Like at Weaviate, and some of these could be evolving, but at Weaviate, what do you think are the best signals for you to capture?
Yeah, good question, right? So I'll caveat this with we're learning, we're exploring, very new area for us, and so we're kind of learning as we go. But some of the ones that I'm really excited about that have started to kind of prove to be fruitful and interesting. One is open source usage, and so there's a variety of ways you can go about tackling this, but the general concept is you install a pixel on some sort of telemetry or open source package that you have. Most tools out there, Rio being one of them, can allow you to kind of de-anonymize it, at the very least the company. And I think that signal is super interesting to me because you can actually figure out which companies are using you open source. So for Weaviate specifically, there's a security element that actually behooves itself to enterprise companies wanting to build open source, because they can actually build on-prem and build something that's specific to them, highly customizable, low friction, high speed. That makes a lot of sense for enterprise companies. So for us, we're seeing a lot of interest and excitement from large enterprise companies where you see 1 or 2 or 10 developers starting to build on open source on Weaviate. So being able to de-anonymize that domain is super interesting. That's one. I can come back to kind of the approach and how we tackle that later if that's one of the follow-ups. Another is job search signal. That one's super fun and unique. It may not be super high volume, but there's, again, a variety of tools that allow you to do this. You can even build scrapers yourself and do it through Clay, what have you, right? There's many options, but essentially you're looking for literal and complementary keyword searches on jobs, right? So we see many jobs where not only are people saying they want someone that's an expert in a vector database, they want someone who's an expert in Weaviate. You pair that with looking into our product usage data. Not only do we not see any usage data, but they don't even use us open source. So you do a little bit of mental math and you try to figure out like, why are they so specifically keyed into Weaviate when they haven't used us before? And then you kind of tailor your approach there. Or on the flip side, you know that they're a self-serve customer that's really high usage and they're posting new roles that mention Weaviate and vector databases. They're doubling down on their investment. So one to keep an eye on. So there's a lot of repercussions to a signal like that, which sounds really simple, but you can use it pre-sales, post-sales, expansion, you name it, right? You can really use it in a lot of interesting ways. Those are the two really, really big ones for us as open source usage. There's obviously the standard ones, right? Which is they come in through the website, they check out the pricing page, but they don't convert. I think those all are tried and true, and it's good to activate those in a pretty simple and straightforward way. But I think the two unique ones are definitely open source usage and job search.
Got it. Very helpful. So a follow-up question on this one, and especially for a product like Weaviate, which is in such a hot space, how do you filter out the signal from the noise? Because I'm guessing your open source is on fire. Like a lot of people, just out of curiosity, are also using it. So how do you make
Yep.
sure that like the RevOps team is helping the sales team, the marketing team, zero in on the right accounts? What helps you differentiate between users and potential buyers?
Yeah. So I think two kind of first principle thoughts on this. One is, signals are not a substitute for any sort of strong product that addresses the real problem. So at the end of the day, you just have to approach this with a mindset that signals are just that, they're signals. Secondly, signals are just a force multiplier for intent, right? The only true signal is the actual response to what you do with that. So to me, in terms of separating the noise, I take a more generous approach, which is if there's any sort of signal and intent, I'd rather action it than to assume that it means nothing. Especially while we're in the learning phase, not just myself in the role or Weaviate as a company, but AI as an industry. No one's really sure what they want to build. Is kind of like my hot take here. Everybody's excited, they're interested, they want to go learn. And we have a unique advantage in the sense that people have a ton of flexibility to go build open source, sign up for a sandbox, then transition to self-serve, then reach out for enterprise. And there's tons of functionality across the spectrum and what they can do with it. So for me, I think I'd rather create more noise to identify what the signal is, I guess is how I'd put that, right? So we're kind of in that phase right now. More kind of specifically when it comes to how to filter out the noise, it really just comes out to the response. Once you figure out what works, you double down on what works, and then you constantly analyze and iterate on your signals and the process behind the signals. And then the last thing is don't go too crazy with the signals, right? I think, again, signals are just that. 2 to 3 is really a pretty strong place to start before you go too crazy and start to develop hundreds and hundreds of signals that all stack on top of each other. I think at the end of the day, something that I do as a gut check is place yourself in the shoes of a user and someone going through the flow. I go through our sign up flow often, just as a reminder and a gut check to say, where do I hit pitfalls and where would I actually display buying intent to then work backwards from RevOps and sales and say what actually is buying intent. And then obviously look at your close won deals and things that have actually worked and materialized into dollars and work backwards from there.
I see. And any insights into and I agree with you, right? Signals are not a replacement for a product that does the job. I think nothing is. But like at Weaviate, you do have a product that works. Like I think social media is raving with compliments. What kind of signals do you think elicit responses? Or what has worked for you so far and what has not worked for you so far? Like if you take a pure lens of what people are responding to, what your audience is responding to, what's working?
Sure. Yeah, I think one that I didn't mention that I think is really interesting is that has been eliciting actual response is building on competitor GitHub repos. So this one's super interesting, right? Not many tools offer this kind of functionality, and so it's a fun one, especially if you're open source.
Yeah.
It's Open source is a double-edged sword. You get to build anonymously, you get to build what you want, you build low friction, but everything is available online. And so we can kind of see when when three different developers at a company are building on three different tools. To us, that backs into, okay, there's a vendor assessment potentially going on, or one head's not talking to the other. How can we bring that conversation together? So that has been eliciting response because someone is truly in the product building, and we can identify more often than not who the person is that's doing the building. It may not elicit a perfect response from a buyer, but it's a starting point with the power user or the person who's going to be doing the building. And at the end of the day, as much as we want to make sales, we also want to help people get value out of the product, and we want to help them do what they need to do in the product. And so being able to actually see that in real time and look at what they're building and understand their questions and where they're hitting roadblocks and what repos they're starring and when and why, right? That's a super interesting developer journey to be able to track. And people seem to be really interested in talking to us about it when we reach out and say, hey, we saw you're building XYZ on this repo. Can we help you get started on Weaviate, in tandem and show you why it's better, right? So I think that's an interesting one that's been eliciting a lot of response. And then the job search one has been eliciting a lot of responses as well. The caveat to that one is you have to figure out who the hiring manager is, which is challenging. So you have to do a little bit of research to figure out who the right person is that may care about that problem at the company. But we're seeing some interesting response there too.
Super. And so I couldn't agree more. I think the number of times we've seen a company evaluate multiple products in the same category, open source, is significantly high. And that is probably one of the top three signals that we also see at Rio across our customers. So like the companies we work with, when they see that happen, the sales team is like very, very excited, especially when that is happening in a company which is your ICP.
Yep.
And I know you have some views on ICP as well. So I'll also ask you to dive deeper there. Like, how do you define your ICP at Weaviate, and what's the science you've brought in over there?
Yeah, good question. Another thing that's a little bit in flux right now. So when I joined the ICP, and it's still to some degree is defined kind of in two different ways, which I know is anti-ICP to do that. But I think there's such a broad market that there's actually a potential to do it in two different ways. One is just the typical Global 2000 is kind of like our benchmark that we've laid out there. Any company that's a true enterprise company, there's a world in which Weaviate could help them with any of their AI applications and what they're developing from an AI standpoint. And then the other is what we call digital native. And that's just kind of like, think of your typical tech company that's large and interested in AI, building something with AI in their product. That one's a little bit more loose in terms of the definition. I could go into the semantics of like engineering headcount and things like that. But I think ultimately the way I'm trying to change the conversation around ICP, and I think this is the time to change the conversation around ICP. Is there's more tools that are disposal than ever before, especially with AI, to think through ICP in a much more specific way to your company than ever before. And previously, when we talk about things like ICP and have the tools that we used to have at our disposal, we could only go off of things like developer headcount and what kind of tools they're building on their website. And I think the biggest miss is that we can't keep up to date with changes in a company at scale. So we use a tool called Seam, getseam.io. You can do this through a variety of different tools, lookalike campaigns through oceans.io, Clay, what have you. But I think the goal is to really understand what product we solve for companies today, or what problem we solve, I should say, at companies today, and back into an ICP definition from that. So an example I can give you for Weaviate is, setting up a vector database as opposed to a relational and traditional database allows you to perform semantic and hybrid search on large data sets. That's kind of like the problem set that we're solving for. So when you translate that to some of the customer or most successful customers and customers that we've helped, we effectively are solving for companies that make money or rely heavily on search. If you were to take that problem statement and try to develop an ICP off of it 5 years ago, you wouldn't really have a way to do that through ZoomInfo or Crunchbase. But now, Seam is the example I'll give. They sit on top of Perplexity, and you could do this yourself through Perplexity too, just as a starting point. You can actually write queries that can recursively back out and say, how does Zapier, as an example, use search as part of their product? How does it generate revenue for them? Where are their issues? Go scrape G2 for all of the negative reviews against their search product and summarize that for me, right? You can take all that and really build an ICP, and not just an ICP. You can build an account list that's actually scored by relevancy of their product to your product. And then you have a much more valuable value proposition and relevant value proposition than just, I saw your Eng headcount was 200 people. Are you interested in talking about how semantic search, right? Like now suddenly that sounds very antiquated and unhelpful.
This is very interesting, Soham. And I want to just reiterate this a little bit more, is defining the ICP sharply is so important. Most of the companies we work with have a very high level ICP, which is fine. At least initially, if you're thinking top of the funnel, that's probably okay. Like a global 2000 for top of the funnel is okay. But I think if you're thinking of investing sales time and effort, really got to define this sharply. I think the company you mentioned is getseam.ai. I think it's really interesting. I would encourage the audience to check that out.
Sure.
All right. So we capture the signals. We use the signals to decipher intent. We figure out ICP in some form or fashion. So we have a set of companies which are good ICP fit, high intent. I think the million-dollar question now is how do we reach out? And I think one of the questions from the audience is, okay, all of this figured, how do we reach out to developers and not sound creepy?
It's a good question, right? So I think I would go back to the original premise, which is how do you reach out to developers? And I would challenge that, really think carefully about what your goal is when reaching out to developers. I think we all know that, again, I'll take an enterprise company just for simplicity of the exercise and at least what's relevant to me. I think if you were to reach out to a startup, the developer may be the user and the champion and the buyer, and then you have to really consolidate your stack of messaging to be super clear. And that's where I think a self-serve motion, just as a thought, is really, really helpful, right? You're not actually trying to treat them as three different personas. You just say, I want you to go get started. You decide if you're ready to buy. You buy when you're ready to buy, and then I'll come back to you when I see you figuring things out, right? Is kind of the general idea with self-serve and flatter organizations. With more vertical organizations that have lots of layers, I would challenge the premise that you just want to reach out to developers. If you do want to reach out to developers, which is not abnormal, I think what you really want to do is come from a standpoint of wanting to help. So a good example is if they're using us open source, our goal is to help them understand that there's a more optimal way to align their setup for low latency and to reduce issues, and production would be better for several other reasons. And what they're building on open source would be better for self-serve, and here's why, right? The more insight you can get into their product usage, the more you can actually cater that messaging. And at the end of the day, I'm of the firm mindset that when you reach out to developers, it has to be something that's pretty damn useful. Otherwise, you're better off saying nothing and letting them be on their way. Maybe the exception to that is you see them start to veer over to a competitor repo or something and you want to jump back in. But if they're building, let them keep building is kind of like my general premise there. In terms of the creepiness aspect, like, I don't know. I think everybody kind of knows that everything is out there for everyone all the time. So it's a little hard to not sound creepy. I think it's better to just be honest and literal and say, hey, I came across your repo, saw you were doing this, saw you ran into this issue. Happy to jump on a call and help you out or connect you with this person who can help you out, right? As long as it's coming from a good place, I think there's always a chance you sound a little creepy, but for the most part, good results. I think the bigger opportunity is to actually approach below and above the line at the same time. And so when you talk about approaching it at the same time, your goal is below the line, offer a helping hand, build developer groundswell, try to get 1 developer to 10 developers to 100 developers building at a company before you have to go make the sell. That's going to make your life as a seller a lot easier. When you talk about above the line, 2 key things, which is educate them about what's happening at their company. They likely don't know. And if they don't know, they can't really help make any sort of sale. So if there are 10, 50, 100 developers building, go tell them about it. Tell them anything you can tell them that is relevant and interesting to them. I think it might be this team. I see they might be building this. Here's what other competitors in your space have built on a vector database. Here's why it matters. And then I think the cherry on top, or the last thing that you always want to end with, is why it drives business outcomes. Like at the end of the day, a CTO is a technical person, but they're part of a C staff and C-suite, and they want to be able to go drive business outcomes just like the CEO and CRO and everybody else in that room. So you need to be able to convey why using a vector database and why 50 of your developers using a vector database is important to drive business outcomes, and then obviously why they should be moving up your kind of product chain to something that's more efficient, cost effective, so on and so forth. So that's kind of like my general premise when tackling that outreach.
Very helpful, Soham. I think just for the audience, I want to summarize and rephrase that a little bit. Is there are two threads that you got to have. And right now we're talking from the perspective of a sales team trying to sell into the engineering org. There are two parallel threads going on. Like as a salesperson, I don't think oftentimes you have the luxury of not selling. That is your day job. You have to be selling eventually, right? So yes, you have to help the developer, but there are two threads happening in parallel. One thread is, like said below the line, what we try like to call developer focused outreach. That cannot be about selling. Well, it can be, but it has to be way more about helping. And I think fully aligned with you, Suam, on that one, which is, and I think one thing where sales teams struggle a lot is it is not very clearly identified what value a salesperson can bring to the developer. And we've seen this happen again and again where SDRs and account execs are actually helpless because they have not been given the right ammunition by the teams, by the marketing team, and so on and so forth. That if a developer is, for example, evaluating Weaviate, what value can you as a salesperson offer to them? Just to give you some examples, can you give them a killer piece of content which will reduce the time of deployment from 10 hours to 2 hours? Can you give them something which is the best practice of deployment, which will save them like bugs and heartburn later on down the funnel? Can you help them? Can you offer them a call with a solution engineer who can sort of do a quick 1 hour hackathon and get them on their way very, very fast? Can you offer them some free credits, right? So I think one very important piece here is the sales team needs to be empowered with the right ammunition for them to go and start a dialogue with the developers. The second part is the timing has to be immaculate. 2 weeks before and the developer doesn't care. 2 weeks late and the developer is already on their way. So you have to have the timing right. When the developer is building something, at that moment, everybody responds. A couple of weeks before, a couple of weeks late, the timing is not right. So this is the below the line. And simultaneously, you got to do the above the line stuff. End of the day, meetings matter, revenue matters. Gone are the days of free money. I think sales teams have very steep targets. Selling is difficult. And I think they fully stand by what you said, Soham. Use all of the data that you can get to make a very personalized outreach to CTOs. So many companies we work with, I can boldly say not a single company has been able to crack automated emailing to CTOs. It just does not work. You set up a sequence for a CTO, the response rate is going to be 0. So it has to be personalized, and hopefully you are writing to CTOs who fit your ICP, who have enough intent, so that the time that you invest in writing a personalized email reaps dividends. But I think that is what it takes. The cookie cutter email mass campaign days are gone.
Yeah, and 100% great summary. And I think, if there ever was a 1 and a 2 in terms of the order of operations, depending on where your company is at and what they need to prioritize, it's obviously highly variable. But I do think if I had to pick one, building developer groundswell makes your life so much easier across the board. And leverage your marketing team. If you have a dev growth or a DevRel team, we have an amazing one at Weaviate. That's where you leverage them to say your goal is to go make as many developers successful with Weaviate at as many companies as possible. That's going to make everyone's life a lot easier. Back to what you mentioned at the top of the call, right? I think developers hold the power. They decide what to build, when to build it. And there's a lot of trust in the developer organization at the average company, at least at the average enterprise company. And so, I think building that sort of relationship with the people who have the trust is just going to pay dividends down the line. And yeah, as far as emailing CTOs with automated messaging, right? Like we haven't cracked it either, and we're testing a lot of things, but I think ultimately nothing beats clear value and conveying the reality of what's happening within their company. And if you can put yourself in the shoes of an employee at that company and really think, what would the CTO want to hear from an employee? Then you're going to be a lot better off in catering your messaging and managing the timeline. So
So there's a great question on chat. I think this question is, can DevRel help in nurturing the champion? And I think this nicely dovetails into a broader discussion, which is how do you orchestrate the three teams? Right? There's DevRel, there's marketing, there's sales, and then there is signal-based selling, which probably caters to all three. Right? So how
Yeah.
do you orchestrate the three teams to be in tandem so that they're not running in different directions? DevRel is focusing on the most prolific vocal developer who happens to be a student, and sales is trying to sell to like Uber, where there is no relationship. So how do you avoid these situations? How do you orchestrate the three teams?
Great question. Candidly, something we are still working on and haven't figured out 100%, but I think step one is have an amazing team, and in each of those buckets is obviously a great start, right? If you don't have a team set up, think through what that looks like and who should be the owner. We have an amazing DevRel team. We have an amazing marketing team, and then really, really great, amazing sales team. So I think that's step one. Step two is the ICP TAM definition that we touched on, right? I think if everybody is not chasing after the same goal, and aligned in the same direction, then naturally, no matter what you do, no matter how much work you put in, you're going to be off. So I think having a very clear set of criteria around your ICP as a customer. Traditionally, DevRel teams are not as keyed into the sales motion. So I think there's always like an alignment that needs to happen, and it'll happen over a course of a longer period of time, where you talk about why we sell to the companies that we sell to, why it matters, and why DevRel should care about it. Because DevRel, at least at Weaviate, is so keyed in on developers and making sure they're successful in building and what they want to do. And as they should be, that's all they care about, that sometimes they may not understand or need to know or want to know about kind of what we care about on the sales side. So keeping that conversation open, and chasing after the same goal on an ICP standpoint is super important. So that's that. In terms of how to make sure they're not kind of colliding with each other and signals, the specifics of how we've kind of aligned it is, these signals stack and overlap at the end of the day. But for the sake of simplicity, you can almost think of the qualified leads that come out of each of these buckets as being different, and then figuring out how to overlap them specific to your business. So we have community qualified leads that the DevRel teams, they don't technically own that metric, but it's a metric that comes out of their work. So we see leads that come out of social, our discourse forum, and our Slack community. That's all through the work of what our DevRel team does to drive people to those mediums. And then if an interesting buyer takes an interesting user or person or persona takes an interesting action as defined within the realm of community, so liking certain posts, certain amount of times, asking certain questions, their overall sentiment from their activity in our Slack community, those are kind of in the realm of what we can consider a community qualified leads. And we've booked meetings purely off of community qualified lead actions. Marketing qualified leads are kind of typical what everybody would be used to, right? So they visit a page, they go to an event, they have a certain score based on your scoring system. Those are kind of like the MQL world. And then I think there's also the product usage side, right? Which is like a PQL, based on certain usage of the product. And that's where things tend to stack and consolidate, right? So you could have someone that attended an event, is super active in your community, super active in the product. You want to be able to calibrate among all those different things to be able to say, here's like a super user that's just engaged across the board. That's the ideal scenario and the dream. But to get there, I think you just have to, and make sure you're not running in different directions. You have to align on your ICP, align on your goal, why we sell to who we sell to, why our most successful customers are successful with our product, and make sure that across the board, everybody understands that. An exercise that can be really helpful is taking your best customer and working backwards and building kind of a buyer and user journey and content journey, and really understanding what did DevRel do to help accelerate this deal? What did sales do? What did marketing do? Where did things slow down, pick up? And then you can kind of actually put something real on paper, when it comes to coordinating those three teams. But ultimately, it's just always a conversation. It's something that needs to always be had, and you need to be intentional about making sure all the teams are keyed in and looped in, for it to be successful. So
Interesting. So I want to ask one very controversial question. Should DevRel start reporting to the VP sales or VP revenue?
It depends on the company, right? I think that wouldn't work at Weaviate because there's just such a different goal. Making developers successful is a more than a full-time job. It's many, many people's full-time jobs. And making sales successful is also many people's full-time jobs. But the focus area is very, very different. I could see a world in which it works for certain companies, but for us, we have an amazing leader who runs DevRel and an amazing leader that runs Dev Growth. And both of them just are full steam ahead in what they do to make developers successful. I think the content creation piece, at least for us, is probably a breaking point of why it wouldn't work under reporting to a head of sales, just because content creation geared towards developers is so important. I think you just need an excellent leader, which we're lucky to have for that team. I think there's something that's kind of like a recent conversation, which is, can you almost create a BDR for dev growth, which is their goal is to find key companies that are, you know, really seeing some interesting developer activity and go bring in 10 more developers. That you could actually put a person behind to go almost prospect against those accounts and say, hey, you know, developer over on this side of the company is using Weaviate, you should go try it out. That could be a really interesting play, something that we're kind of thinking about.
Very interesting. I like that. Because if it all starts from the developer, why shouldn't we have people bring more developers in the funnel?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think everybody approaches this with an idealistic mindset of if your product is amazing, developers will find it. I think the reality is it's a very crowded marketplace for almost any tool, any software, anything you're trying to sell, you will have competitors. Attention span is at its lowest. Deliverability is at its lowest. And loyalty is at its lowest. It's so easy to just jump from one tool to another. Almost every tool offers like a switching, either they'll pay for something or they make it really easy to switch. Everybody has their own biases from prior companies. So it's really challenging to keep people's attention. So it takes intentional thought, creation of relevant content, and really, really caring about the user and the customer and making sure that you're actually delivering what they care about and not just surface level things that make you feel better about what you've sold them. If you're not really thinking critically about that piece, then the whole machine's going to fall apart. So I think there's a world in which you may see developer BDRs or DBRs, I guess, that go out there and you know, they may be a technical resource, but somebody that's just really interested in helping bring on more developers at these kinds of companies that you're selling to.
That's a very interesting thought, Soham. And I think that's a very good note. And I think, like you summarized, it is business development in the hard mode, right? Because so much competition, attention spans, everything that you said. I think that's where signal-based selling sort of comes in. And I'll just end this with that note that the end of the day, I think what you're saying is what we are seeing across the industry. Gone are the days of 2022 when you build something and you wait for 5 years for somebody to say, hey, I'm ready to pay. I think today the expectation is you build something, you see if people are willing to pay for it, and they just keep iterating. I think with everything that's happening in the ecosystem, signal-based selling is the way to go. And thank you so much, Soham, for sharing how you're doing this at Weaviate.
Yeah, appreciate you guys inviting me.
Lovely. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining. We hope this was useful. We will send out recordings. We will send out notes from this call. And once again, Soham, thank you so much for joining this.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.